Hello. This is my submission for the week four participation. To begin with the first question, which is after reading the journal articles, what new knowledge did I gain from reading them? So for the first one, with the Myholes and Applegate, I learned about the various parts of the brain and how they have a sophisticated way of communicating with each other. I didn't know that they have 100 billion cells. Um, I heard of the word neurons, but this is what these 100 billion cells are called, and they facilitate communication among the brain areas. And then it started talking about the reptilian brain or the brain stem and how it's a basic survival psychological process. And it helps with respiration, body temperature, sleep cycles. So that's a brainstem and reptilian brain. And then there's also the limbic system, which helps integrate and regulate key mental and emotional processes like attachment. So that's really important because we work with attachment all the time and secure, insecure. So limbic system deals with that. And then third, the neocortex is a part of the brain that is involved with thinking, cognitive, and perceptual processing, the center of all that. So that was all new information to me. I'd um, never seen them before. And it was also interesting to learn that secure attachment contributes to optimal brain development and how, on the other side, if you have traumatic events or traumatic parenting, it can lead to self-protective behaviors in the child that impair mental functions of their developing brain. This was obviously a pattern recurring throughout all the readings, how the developing brain, if it gets traumatized, it severely affects them and it can impair their ability to emotionally process and do a lot of things later in life. It traumatizes them. And then the third part from this first article that I got was that caregivers who experience difficulties with their own regulation have a difficult time assisting in children help deal with their emotional development. So I thought this was an important thing to note, that it's new knowledge that I gained because it shows how uh, a caregiver is not able to effectively create positive emotion in the emotional development for their child if they can't regulate themselves. So it's all about self-care and being able to deal with ourselves before we try to help other people in client based and also in parenting. And so moving on to the second one, Mason et al. Article, it went over NMT and how it is based on several key neuroscientific principles. But the first new knowledge that I gained is that the brain develops sequentially from the bottom to top. I didn't know that. And if your lower development is successful, then that is a predictor for the higher development. So it's bottom to top. And in order for the higher one to be successful, it depends on the lower. And an area of the brain is most malleable when it's actively developing. So it comes extremely critical when you want to know when a child experienced trauma and what part of their brain was affected by it and when it was affected by it. Because if it was a part of the brain that is malleable and still developing, it could be the most detrimental to their emotional processing in the future because it's developing and it's weak. And overall, the NMT was able to help increase ability to uh, communicate interprofessionally with the attending physicians and psychiatrists. And they gained knowledge in learning NMT and that offered a shared language with medical professionals. So it ended up being beneficial. Lastly, the third article was the Shapiro and Applegate one. The first new knowledge that I gained from it was that the development of neural connections with the brain systems undergo the greatest transformations of infancy and early childhood. I've always heard growing up that the brain is changing and not fully developed until about like 25, but I didn't know that the greatest development undergo transformations in this time period. So this was new information. And going back, this is similar to the other article too. The knowledge that I thought was important from this article was when it said the quality of interactions between child and caregivers influences the development of brain structures, which in turn potentially helps regulate social, emotional functioning and motivational states. So obviously the interaction between a child and caregiver is extremely important to develop these neural connections. And this is where secure and insecure attachment is formed. So moving on, what knowledge specifically expanded my foundational understanding of the brain? The left brain uh, begins to reconsider conscious ideas that help explain automatic response of the right brain. So it was talking about flipping your lid, and the the left brain, when you're older, you're able to consciously like react to sensory things, and someone who's a child that's not like affected enough and not developed enough, they'll be the example they gave is they'll be frightened by a large dog, where a an adult will be able to calm themselves because their left brain was more accurately able to register it and like calm them down, and the developing child won't be able to. And I like my foundational understanding of the brain was also I answered this a little bit in the last questions too, but I thought that if you experience trauma at a time when your brain was developing, your ability to regulate and process emotions can be negatively affected. So it's really critically important, I thought, from this to point out that you need to know when you affected trauma and where your brain was developing at, because yeah, emotional processing can be negatively affected, and it's critically different between kids and adults in terms of being able to deal with outside scary experiences or experiences in general. So moving on to chapter 3, building what I've read from the text, what is the best approach when you notice dislocation? There was a whole lot of stuff from this that I got out of it. And going back to last chapters too, I said that when you're noticing a children is dissociating, you got to approach it with patience and caution. They are exhibiting trauma response and make some out of body to avoid being re-traumatized. So the last thing you want to do is overwhelm them with questions, overbear them. You need to have crucial care and patience from a clinician standpoint. You need to give them time to share if they want to, give them space. And then also the article mentioned about creating consistently routine and familiarity. And then I quoted Rhonda saying, make the unknowns known. So the more that we're able to be clear with what our intent is and who we are, and how we're trying to help them out, the better. Make sure that they're informed as much as they can for, being a traumatized person, especially with the developing brain and a younger person, they can always be confused and scared. Um, they also mentioned that it's best to associate to, if you notice association, you have to apply our understanding of how fear affects the brain, and then consequently it changes behavior. So when someone dissociates, they're afraid. So it in turn affects their behavior. So you need to take this into account. And also powerful group influences are in human life, and how the human brain cannot really be understood outside of this context. So powerful groups are very important too when dealing with association. So what exactly is dissociation? How do you navigate it? Some examples of dissociation in the chapter 4 was that this girl responded as though she hadn't heard a question. She crawled under a table, tucked herself in a fetal position, didn't move, didn't talk, didn't engage or give them time. This is extremely eerie, the author said. And I wrote for an actual description. It's a phenomenon in which a person's mind and body feel disconnected from the reality of the event. Well, that was actually one of the quotes from the book, but that's, they feel disconnected, and they go outside of body. When they were upset and they had to confront things that they weren't ready to think about is often when they dissociated. An example they gave was interviews with law enforcement, which obviously they were traumatized. So an important part about this is exposing a person to chronic fear and stress is weakening. The example they said is breaking the power of a car while adding more powerful engine. And so I wrote that avoid re-traumatization at all costs. Don't have them be exposed to stress if you can, because it's just going to weaken their ability to process it and to successfully deal with these issues and talk about them with a therapist. So recognize the power of relationships you have, and the relational cues is essential to effective therapeutic work with traumatized children. And you also need to be able to give them choices, is what is talked about too. And this is also something I learned in a child's class, like giving them space and giving them time, giving them choices is essential, because they don't really have control over why they were traumatized or how they got traumatized. And you need to be able to just give them choices to do whatever it may be. In this book, a lot of time these just coloring with them, just waiting, asking what they want to do and giving them freedom. It's like I said earlier, making the unknowns known, just like give them the full ability to create the reality, because they don't have a lot of choice at that age. And relationships do matter. People, not programs, change people, which I thought was interesting and new knowledge that I thought would be beneficial to mention, because even though a program can be good, it's the people who aren't burnt out that really matter. So in terms of what other clinical issues manifested in the brain stimulants of children, there was an elevated heart rate, which was a likely reflection of a girl's persistent active stress response system, a lot of PTSD in general. It also mentioned that usually boys, but also sometimes girls, would behave aggressively, throwing things when asked a question that made them recall, so they would get re-traumatized, or responding verbally with anger. So yeah, I put that this is PTSD from extremes, things they suffered. So PTSD, anger issues, I'm sure, ADHD, and lots of other things that come with traumatization. And then lastly, the brain heuristic, what components are included in it. So I, going through the videos and the readings, wasn't able to specifically find the words stated brain heuristic, but if I understand it correctly, this is going over the components of the brain that were in both Luke chapter 2 and the lecture video that Dr. Rodriguez went over. So for what components are included in it, first there's the hindbrain, midbrain, and the forebrain. And we're going over from Dr. Rodriguez's video. It starts at the molecular level and it processes from the cellular level. Then there's a second stage, which is neurons and their functioning. The third, which has the structural hemispheres, lobes, and amygdala. Fourth, behavioral, physical manifestation of the brain system, the systemic and the limbic system. And 5 is the metacognitive, which is making sense of things. You have one brain, according to Luke, 2 hemispheres, left and right. The left deals with facts and details, speech reasoning, and the right is more sensory input, auditory visual awareness, creativeness, spatial and temporal awareness. And lastly, for the primitive structures that comprise it, there's serotonin, which aids in transmitting signals for regulating mood, learning. There's dopamine, which is pleasure and pain. Norepinephrine, which is regulating concentration and alertness. Acetylcholine, which is primary role of autonomic nervous system and a memory function, so memory. The GABA, which is accidental neurons. Endorphins, suppress pain, promotes euphoria. Melatonin, we've all heard of melatonin, assisting in sleep. And then finally glutamate, in amino acid and neurotransmitter. Yeah, their functions mainly protect neurons and excites action potentials in neurons. Yeah, and if that's not specifically what the brain heuristic was for, the other definition of brain heuristics are specific things that your brain goes to when you're reminded of things. They could create study heuristics when you want to remember something. Your brain like creates reminders and study guides, if that's the other brain heuristic definition. But I don't think that's what it is. And after consulting with my classmates, that's what I thought too. So yeah, this is already over.